Hello, everyone, and welcome. The time is 1:01 p.m. Eastern, and we're now going to start the public scoping meeting for the environmental review of the Empire Wind Construction and Operations Plan for Commercial Lease OCS-A-0512 offshore New York. Thank you, everyone, for participating. My name is Pam Chanel, and I'll serve as the facilitator for today's meeting. I'm with ICF, the independent third-party contractor supporting the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. I do want to note that this meeting is being recorded, so if you do not wish to be part of a recorded meeting, please disconnect from the call. The recording of this meeting will be posted on the project website. I want to walk us through the agenda for today's meeting. We're going to begin with a series of opening remarks and then presentations, which should take about an hour. First, Jim Bennett, the program manager for BOEM's Renewable Energy Program, will provide a few opening remarks. Next, I'm sure that many of us have become familiar with Zoom over the last year, but we'll review a few tips for the Zoom platform, and I'll point out some key features that we'll be using today. We'll then move into a few presentations. The first presentation is a brief background and history of the offshore energy leasing process, given by Josh Ganji of BOEM. Following Josh, Brandy Sanganet, the BOEM NEPA team lead for this project, will provide an overview of the environmental review process. That will be followed by a presentation by Laura McLean with the New York Department of State, and then Laura Morales with Empire Wind will provide an overview of the proposed project. Well, at that point, we'll take a quick break to let folks stretch before we reconvene to take public comments. And following the formal public comments, we'll take another quick break and conclude with a question and answer session. So as you can see, we have a full agenda for today. Let's go ahead and get started. And thank you again for joining us. I'd like to introduce Jim Bennett, the Chief of the Office of Renewable Energy Programs within BOEM, for some introductory remarks. Jim?
Hello, thank you, Pam, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Jim Bennett, and I am the Program Manager for the Office of Renewable Energy Programs here at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Department of the Interior to this, the third and final virtual scoping meeting for the Empire Wind Energy Project Draft Environmental Impact Statement. This virtual environment during COVID has proven to be an effective alternative to in-person meetings. Our BOEM team has realized considerable success, and I am sure that will be the case today. We are here to hear from you about the Empire Wind Energy Project and the environmental analysis to be conducted under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. For those of you who aren't familiar with BOEM, we are the bureau within the Department of the Interior that oversees the development of our energy and mineral resources on the Outer Continental Shelf, or OCS. That's almost 2.5 billion acres of the OCS, which extends from the 3-mile line of state jurisdiction out to the full extent of the EEZ, or Exclusive Economic Zone, approximately 200 miles offshore. We at BOEM are responsible for the expeditious and orderly development of the energy resources of the OCS, including renewables like wind. It's our job to ensure this development is done in an environmentally and economically responsible way. Our review and possible approval of the Empire Wind project is considered a major federal action. And as a result, we are preparing an environmental impact statement, or EIS, under the National Environmental Policy Act. The NEPA process helps ensure that all relevant information and analysis is included in decision-making. So this meeting is an opportunity for us to hear your concerns and your information regarding the scope of the environmental analysis. Further, the BOEM team will also be available to answer your questions. But this is your time to speak. We consider public input to be a critical component of safe and responsible offshore resource management. Your thoughts on this matter are valuable. The development of the offshore industry over the past decade or so has varied a lot, but one constant has been our efforts to ensure stakeholder and public involvement. Your participation and feedback today is essential to BOEM's renewable energy program and plays a vital role in our environmental analysis of the proposed project. We look forward to your thoughts about the scope of the draft environmental impact statement. Thank you. And with that, back to you, Pam.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Jim. I want to take just a minute or two to review the features that we'll be using during our Zoom meeting today. At any time during the meeting, if you need assistance with the Zoom platform, you can use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen to message the meeting host, or you can send an email to empirewind@icf.com. That's EMPIREWIND@ICF.com. We appreciate your participation in this online public meeting. We'd all much rather be with you in person, but given the current circumstances, we wanted to be able to provide the information to you while protecting everyone's health. So we'll work to conduct this meeting in a manner that closely resembles that of an in-person meeting. I'd like to suggest that you make note of the phone number for this meeting. The phone number is 1-888-788-0099. The meeting ID is 843-1625-7998. And the password is 79493630. If you experience difficulty with your internet connection at any point during this meeting, you can call that number to listen to the meeting. Additionally, individual internet connections and bandwidths can vary and may impact your viewing experience. So we recommend closing all apps and other programs and limiting any streaming or downloads while you're connected to this meeting. And finally, we're running this meeting using Zoom Webinar, which mutes all participants and restricts video feed. When we get to the public comment and the question and answer portions of today's meeting, the meeting host will unmute you. Finally, for any media representatives that joined the meeting today, please contact Stephen Boutwell, the Public Information Officer, at stephen.boutwell@boem.gov. That's STEPHEN.BOUTWELL@BOEM.gov. And finally, let's run through a few ground rules for today's online public scoping meeting. As previously stated, we're going to provide several presentations before accepting formal comments, and BOEM will answer clarifying questions that are raised during the meeting today. When we get to the formal comment period for today's call, I'll call on the people who requested to make a comment when they registered. All names will be called in the order in which we received your registration. After that, after those folks have commented, I will ask that if anyone else wants to make a comment, you'd use the raise your hand feature on the Zoom platform to make a comment. If you're calling in from a phone, you would press *9, and I'll call on people in the order in which they raise their hand to comment. During the comment period, I'll post the names of the next 5 speakers in the chat so you can see when your turn is coming. When I call your name, you'll receive a pop-up box on your screen, or for those of you on the phone, you'll hear a prompt that'll allow you to unmute yourself and make your comment. And then throughout today's meeting, if you think of a question that you'd like to have clarified, please type your question into the question and answer box on the Zoom platform. And when we get to the question and answer portion of today's meeting, BOEM staff will answer your clarifying questions. Please note that when we do receive your questions and the team begins working on an answer, we'll move your question from that Q&A box into something called the dismiss category. And then once we're ready, we'll read the question and provide an answer aloud to you. We'll review all of this again before the comment period and the question and answer session. Please do keep in mind that this meeting is being recorded and transcribed, and I'd ask that there be no inappropriate language. We do have a large number of participants on the call and those who previously registered to speak. So I'll be asking everyone to keep their comments to no more than 5 minutes. I would note that scoping comments can also be submitted through regulations.gov or through the US mail. And all comments, whether received orally or in writing, are weighed equally. We appreciate the opportunity to share these project updates and the environmental process with all of you. We wish that we could be together in person, but we're glad to come together virtually today. And again, the purpose of today's meeting is to share information about the project and to receive public scoping comments. Well, with that, we're ready to get started with our presentations for today's meeting. Our first presenter is Josh Ganji of BOEM. Josh?
Hello, thanks, Pam. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Ganji, and I'm a project coordinator in BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. Today, I will be providing an overview of the 6-year planning and leasing process and the great deal of coordination and engagement that has led to the proposed development of the Empire Wind lease area, the subject of today's meeting. Hopefully, this information will help inform your comments. Next slide, please. This slide depicts our renewable energy leasing process in its 4 stages: planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, construction and operations. Empire Wind is now in the construction and operations phase. However, we'll focus on the planning and analysis and leasing portion of the process to describe how this lease area was identified and leased. Next slide, please. Specifically, this portion of the process includes a few notable milestones. First, the request for interest or RFI. Next, the call for information and nominations. Third, the area identification process. And fourth, parallel processes begin where there's a development of the leasing documents, including the proposed sale notice and the final sale notice, along with the environmental assessment. As you can see on the image here, it's the overlapping areas are towards the end there. Next slide, please. Oh, excuse me. Actually, can you go back a slide? And finally, the final step in the process is the lease sale. I'd like to note that the renewable energy task forces have been involved throughout this process to exchange information and help inform BOEM's decision making. And I'll be highlighting a few of these convenings in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So how does this particular lease fit into our process? Here is the high-level overview. After an initial task force meeting in November 2010, the process started with a request from the New York Power Authority for a particular portion of the OCS to be leased for renewable energy. After another task force meeting in April of 2012, the request was further refined in June of that year. When BOEM receives an unsolicited request such as this, our regulations require us to determine if anyone else is interested in leasing that particular area as well. If there is no interest, this area is leased through our non-competitive leasing process. In order to answer this question, BOEM published a request for interest in January 2013, and as it turns out, there was competitive interest. So we are required to then proceed through our competitive leasing process. A task force meeting was held in September 2013 to inform a call for information and nominations and a notice of intent for environmental assessment, which was published in May of 2014. Information received in response to this call, along with the coordination with relevant local, state, and federal agencies, resulted in a wind energy area designation in March of 2016. This was shortly followed by a proposed sale notice in June of 2016 and a final sale notice in September 2016, and then finally a lease sale just before the holidays in 2016. Next slide, please. Specifically, the unsolicited lease request from the New York Power Authority included up to 194 3.6 megawatt turbines in the area located between the traffic separation schemes depicted here. The traffic separation schemes being the red triangles surrounding the lease area. The request for interest published in January 2013 and it not only identified competitive interest, but also highlighted key issues, including navigational safety, commercial fisheries, and visual impacts. Next slide, please. This leasing process is unique in that we did not see that much of a difference between the initial areas outlined in the RFI and what was included in the eventual lease areas, largely due to the due diligence performed by the New York Power Authority and the relative conflicts in the region. As you can see here, the call area and the wind energy area designation included the same areas. The environmental assessment examined the effects of leasing, site characterization, and site assessment and was completed in June 2016. Next slide. Navigational safety was and is a key issue for this lease. To inform our decision-making process, BOEM conducted a robust analysis, which included the analysis of vessels per aliquot over a year, which showed similar traffic patterns across years and great adherence to the TSSs entering and exiting New York Harbor. There was also a low number of vessels traversing the RFI area and a concern of setback from the potential lease area. Next slide. The use of the wind energy area for fishing activities was identified as a priority in BOEM's deconflicting process. In particular, it was noted that the communication between a future lessee and the commercial fisheries industry was a critical step towards potential coexistence between the two industries. Next slide, please. A proposed sale notice has an informative name as it very much outlines the proposal for the upcoming sale, including the lease area, auction process, and financial terms. In this case, BOEM proposed the area identified by the New York Power Authority at 81,130 acres via an ascending bid auction format. Next slide, please. The final sale notice was published in October 2016 in response to comments from NIMS regarding the ecological significance of Cholera Bank located at the northwestern portion of the proposed lease area. BOEM removed 5 aliquots from the final lease area offered in the final sale notice. This resulted in a 79,350 acre lease area. The final sale notice included notes to potential bidders that future mitigation measures may be applied to development in the lease area as it relates to maritime navigation, fisheries, and visual impacts. Specifically, BOEM required no surface occupancy in portions of the lease that are transected by the 1 nautical mile line setback. This was also the first commercial lease in which BOEM included a fisheries communication plan and a fisheries liaison requirement. Additionally, BOEM altered the auction format to multiple factor bidding and offered a 10% bidding credit for entities that qualified as a government authority. Next slide. The resulting auction was held in December of 2016 and was the highest grossing and longest auction to date. The auction started with 6 participants lasting 33 rounds over 2 days and resulted in a high bid of over $42 million. Next slide, please. Empire Wind most recently submitted their updated construction and operations plan in July 2021. A public version of the COP is now listed on our website. BOEM can approve, disapprove, or approve with conditions this COP, and this will happen after the environmental impact statement is complete and will be documented by the record of decision. You'll be hearing much more about these processes later tonight. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. Our next presenter is Brandy Sanganet, also with BOEM. Brandy?
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join us. Let me pull up. My name is Brandy Sanganet, and I'm an environmental coordinator with BOEM. Thank you for attending today's Empire Wind public scoping meeting. I'll be talking about the National Environmental Policy Act process, BOEM's approach to the analysis of the construction and operations plan, and how you can provide input into the process. We are excited about today's turnout. We have 134 attendees from multiple agencies, industries, and the public. Just to name a few that have joined us today: energy developers, unions, recreational users, the fishery industry, consultants, nonprofits, state agencies, news organizations, and all those from the general public. We thank you for your time and interest in our project. Next slide, please. BOEM uses a multi-phased approach to grant access to ocean areas that may be suitable for wind development. The figure provided describes the phases and the amount of time each step generally takes to lease, review, approve, and construct an offshore wind facility on the outer continental shelf. The process begins with the identification of potential areas for wind development indicated by everything before the blue ribbon, which Josh Gandy went over in his presentation. Following the completion of the leasing phase, surveys are done to determine if the leased area is suitable for wind farm construction and to identify what physical, cultural, and natural resources are present within the lease area. These surveys serve as the backbone of knowledge and aid in the development of the construction and operations plan. The construction and operations plan is a project proposal, not a decision document. Following completion of the surveys and submission of the construction and operations plan, BOEM conducts a review of the plan and decides if it's sufficient to begin the National Environmental Policy Act process. This stage of the process is where we are today and is identified in orange on this diagram. Next slide, please. Empire Wind submitted their initial construction and operations plan on January 10th, 2020. With the most recent version of this proposal received in July, it says here June 24th, but we've recently gotten another update. The construction and operations plan is focused is the focus of the environmental review. At the conclusion of the environmental impact statement, a decision will be made to approve, disapprove, or approve with modification the construction and operations plan proposal through the issuance of a record of decision. For a copy of the Empire Wind Construction and Operations Plan, please see the web address listed here, www.boem.gov/empire-wind. Next slide, please. The National Environmental Policy Act is a law that requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions and reasonable alternatives prior to making decisions. As mentioned in the previous slide, the construction and operations plan proposal is the focus of this environmental review. The environmental impact statement will include both onshore and offshore components. Listed in this slide are BOEM actions where the National Environmental Policy Act is applied during the decision-making process. They are as follows: at lease issuance for survey work, for plan approvals, site assessment plans, construction and operation plans, or general activities plans, and prior to decommissioning activities. Next slide, please. The environmental review is a multi-step process that provides opportunities for public input. In the diagram provided, you will note the environmental impact statement process is anticipated to take approximately 24 months from start to finish. The National Environmental Policy Act process began at the issuance of the Notice of Intent on June 24th. June 24th is also the date that begins your first opportunity to provide input on the construction and operations plan proposal. The 30-day public scoping period began on the day the Notice of Intent was published in the Federal Register and will conclude on July 26th, 2021. Following the conclusion of the scoping period, BOEM, in coordination with our cooperating agencies, will begin the development of the draft environmental impact statement. Once the draft environmental impact statement has been completed, a notice of availability will be posted in the Federal Register and will begin your second opportunity for input. During this 45-day public review and comment period, several hearings will be held for the public to provide input on the draft environmental impact statement. At the conclusion of the draft environmental impact statement review period, BOEM and the cooperating agencies will address comments received from the public and begin writing the final environmental impact statement. Following the conclusion of the final environmental impact statement, a notice of availability will be issued in the Federal Register. A record of decision will be issued no sooner than 30 days following the notice of availability for the final environmental impact statement. Next slide, please. The Notice of Intent can be found at the following website, You can go to the federalregister.gov and enter in 86-FR-33351. All comments submitted through the environmental review process throughout the environmental review will be available to you and can be found at regulations.gov under docket number BOEM-2021-0038. Next slide, please. The scoping period is your first opportunity to provide input and is an important stage of the National Environmental Policy Act process. Public comment submitted during the scoping period provides valuable local experience and perspective that aids BOEM in its decision-making process. Public input, such as the raising of significant issues, sharing of information sources BOEM may not have considered, and recommendation of reasonable alternatives are critical inputs to the development of a well-informed draft environmental impact statement. Please note all comments must be received no later than July 26th for consideration. Next slide, please. Today's scoping meeting is the last of 3 virtual meetings. The dates and times for all 3 meetings are listed here for your convenience. All meetings are being recorded and will be available to the public. The information provided in this meeting is the same for each public scoping meeting for this environmental review. I encourage you to go to the virtual meeting room website located at www.boem.gov/empire-win-scoping-virtual-meetings, where you will find additional information and resources on the proposal, such as fact sheets, project posters, and meeting information. Directions on how to provide comments during this phase of the environmental review can also be found here. Next slide, please. There are 3 ways you can provide input during the scoping period. In this meeting, you can provide comments by raising your hand within the Zoom platform. You may also submit your comments in writing and mail them to the address listed in this slide. If you prefer, you can submit your comments online at the following website, www.regulations.gov. Next slide, please. An environmental impact statement is a National Environmental Policy Act document meant to provide information to the public and federal government decision makers on the proposed action, alternatives to the proposed action, and an analysis of environmental impacts. Impacts identified during the environmental review may be either beneficial or adverse. For example, the route the transmission line could take to reach a substation from the wind farm, or how much distance between the wind turbine could be alternatives to the proposed action. The length of time to construct the wind farm is also an example. The environmental impact statement will include a no action alternative. Selection of the no action alternative would result in BOEM's disapproval of the construction and operations plan submitted by Empire Wind. If this alternative is selected, it does not mean that the wind farm would never be constructed in this lease area. It would mean that the construction and operations plan proposal BOEM is considering would not be approved. The environmental impact statement will include reasonably foreseeable environmental trends and planned actions other than those present in the construction and operations plan proposal. Next slide, please. The environmental impact statement analysis is a comprehensive look at the biological, physical, and socioeconomic impacts that may occur during the proposed construction, operation, and decommissioning of the wind farm. Examples of biological resources include marine mammals, bats, and birds. Impacts to physical resources include air and water quality. A few examples of socioeconomic resources that may be impacted are commercial fishing, tourism, cultural resources, climate change, visual resources, and environmental justice, just to name a few. The environmental review will be looking at all these resources for both beneficial and adverse impacts. Next slide, please. What is a design envelope and why has BOEM approved this approach towards the construction and operations plan? A design envelope approach is a permitting approach that allows lessees the option to submit a reasonable range of design parameters within its construction and operations plan. Under these conditions, BOEM's environmental review would apply the upper limit of each design parameter to ensure the resources are being analyzed for the greatest potential impact. This allows BOEM to continue the environmental review process without having to pause and restart as the project is refined to the final design. A change to a project design parameter could be a change in wind turbine height. In this example, BOEM would analyze the impacts on each resource that would occur using the maximum potential height of the wind turbines to be installed. If Empire Wind chooses to construct wind turbines below that maximum height, the impacts would be less than those analyzed in the proposed in the construction and operations plan environmental impact statement. Revisions outside the design envelope would require additional review and consultation. Next slide, please. The environmental review will run concurrently with consultations. The consultations included under this environmental impact statement include Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. Next slide, please. BOEM is implementing NEPA substitution for Section 106 review, mainly due to lessons learned from the earliest construction and operations plans, consultations, and reflections of stakeholder needs. This process provides a streamlined approach that better integrates National Historic Preservation Act and National Environmental Policy Act reviews, both thematically and in terms of schedule. It also provides lessees clear expectations of environmental review timelines and costs associated with mitigations. Using this process will provide consulting parties and stakeholders earlier and more direct input into the selection of alternatives and mitigation measures. The National Environmental Policy Act substitution approach will also help BOEM to engage with tribes more effectively and facilitate an increased focus on government-to-government consultation. Next slide, please. This diagram shows the major National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 process milestones, highlighted in light blue, and how they are integrated into the NEPA process. You can also view, for more information about this diagram and the integration process, you can view the consultation party guide, which can be found at the consulting party guide, which can be found on our virtual meeting website. Next slide, please. Through this process, BOEM is now seeking comment and input regarding identification of historic properties and/or potential effects to historic properties from activities associated with approval of the Empire Wind COP. Reasonable alternatives, such as size, geographic, or other restrictions on construction and siting of facilities and activities, and potential mitigation measures to be analyzed in the EIS, including ways to avoid, minimize, or otherwise treat and resolve adverse effects on historic properties. Next slide, please. The draft environmental impact statement is currently scheduled for release in the summer of 2022. A Federal Register notice of availability will begin the 45-day public review and comment period. During this time, several public hearings will be held. The 45-day public review will provide you with the second opportunity to provide input into the National Environmental Policy Act process for the Empire Wind Construction and Operations Plan proposal. I hope that by this stage of the environmental review, things will have returned more to normal so that we can have those hearings in person. The final environmental impact statement is currently scheduled for release in spring of 2023. A Federal Register notice of availability for the environmental impact statement will be released at that time. In the summer of 2023 is when BOEM anticipates concluding all consultations for the Empire Wind EIS and the publishing of the record of decision. Next slide, please. In the last couple of minutes of my time today, I wanted to share some information about BOEM's Environmental Studies program. This program is intended to take a proactive approach to fund and complete studies that will aid BOEM in conducting environmental reviews. In these last two slides, I have provided a few examples of relevant studies to the Empire Wind lease area. If you would like to learn more about the studies listed here, please type the corresponding web address into your browsers or visit the website at www.boem.gov/renewable-energy-environmental-studies. Here are two examples, and on the next slide, I have some more. Next slide, please. Two more examples, and here's the website again. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Brandy. Our next speaker is Laura McLean from the New York Department of State. Laura?
Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura McLean. I'm a Coastal Energy Review Specialist with the New York State Department of State, which administers the New York State Coastal Management Program. Thank you very much for this opportunity to provide a brief overview of New York State Coastal Consistency Reviews, and I'll be speaking about what Coastal Consistency Review is and how it applies to this project. Next slide. This CZMA, or Coastal Zone Management Act, was enacted in 1972 to comprehensively manage the uses and resources along the nation's coastline. And at the time, this came when there was rapid development in the coastal area, as well as a high density of population growth in the area as well. And at a time when environmental stewardship was coming into focus. So the act created a federal state partnership where coastal states could elect to develop coastal management programs. And federal consistency is one component of those coastal management programs. Under CZMA, it says that federal actions that affect any land or water use or natural resource of the state's coastal zone must be consistent with the enforceable policies of that coastal management program. So what does that mean? Next slide. The core idea here is reverse federalism. So if a federal permit or authorization is required that affects a coastal program's uses and resources, it must be found consistent with that coastal management program. And there's 4 types of federal actions that are subject to CZMA. For the Empire Wind project, there will be 2 types of federal reviews. One for federal permitting associated with the Corps of Engineers permit, and the second associated with the construction and operations plan, which is a type of outer continental shelf plan for renewables. And New York uses the federal consistency review as one mechanism to implement its coastal management plan. Next slide. Many coastal states and Great Lakes states have coastal management programs that are federally approved, and New York State is no exception. The New York Coastal Management Program was enacted in 1982. It incorporates New York State Executive Article 42 and a range of other state laws into one comprehensive set of enforceable policy statements. The 44 coastal policies address broad categories like development, energy, fish, wildlife, and recreational uses that either promote their beneficial use, prevent their impairment, or address major activities that could substantially affect these resources. And importantly, a project that's that is undergoing federal consistency review must be consistent with all applicable policies. It cannot be inconsistent with any one. The coastal area for New York is shown on the right in yellow. It generally it includes all tidal waters, the shoreline of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, St. Lawrence, and Niagara Rivers. And the seaward boundary of the coastal area extends to the 3 nautical mile limit, which represents the state territorial waters. Importantly, for offshore wind projects, the state can review activities beyond the 3 nautical mile line in federal waters where the state has demonstrated reasonably foreseeable effects to its coastal uses and resources. Next slide. So there are many coastal policies for New York that are applicable to offshore wind as well as to the Empire Wind Project, but I want to highlight one in particular. This is Coastal Policy 29, and it speaks to the responsible development of offshore uses and resources, including renewable energy like offshore wind, that it must be done in a way that accommodates uses like commercial recreational fishing, maritime commerce, and ecological functions and habitats important to New York. Another important part of the state coastal management program are these special management areas. For the Empire Wind, the local waterfront revitalization programs, or LWRPs, and the significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats are likely to have the most bearing on project elements, particularly transmission that enters state waters. The LWRPs are localized versions of the state coastal management program where the local municipality can adopt specific policies to protect their unique places and guide local development. So for example, New York City has an LWRP that will be applicable for Empire Wind activities affecting New York City. Next slide. So as I mentioned, for this project, DOS plans to undertake 2 separate types of consistency reviews, one for the BOEM review of the construction and operations plan, and the other for the Corps of Engineers application. And both of these reviews are anticipated to be individual consistency reviews due to the project size and complexity. After each of these reviews begin, DOS coordinates with the LWRP and we issue a public notice. And the public notice gets published in the New York State Register and on Department of State's website. Links are found at the end of my presentation. And throughout its review, DOS carefully reviews the project to evaluate whether there exists the potential for significant coastal effects as guided by our 44 policies. And often DOS will request additional data and information to make that determination. Now, there's a few key differences between the way these 2 reviews will occur, and I'd like to highlight a few of those. For the COP, notably, DOS has already begun review. It began when BOEM published the notice of intent a few weeks ago. Also, DOS and Empire have entered into what's called a stay of review, which essentially pauses our review clock until the DEIS is published. And so our review will resume once the DEIS is published, and all information requests must be made within the first 3 months of our review, which in this case will happen approximately 3 months after that DEIS is published. So it's important for New York to act quickly, solicit detailed feedback early in our review. And the last differentiator here that I'd like to highlight is that the time frame for a decision on the COP can occur within 3 months of starting review, but it can be extended up to 6 months if there's a basis for needing more time. Next slide. And when DOS has completed its review, it has the option of issuing either a concurrence or an objection that could take any of these forms. So for a concurrence, it could be a straight concurrence with the accepting the applicant's consistency certification. It could be based upon agreed upon modifications, or it could be a concurrence where DOS drafts conditions that are required for the project to be fully consistent with the coastal management program. If the applicant refuses any of those conditions in a conditional concurrence, then that becomes an objection. Another type of objection is if there's If the information presented is not sufficient for DOS to render a decision, for construction and operations plan, there's also the possibility that DOS could object to one or more of the federal permits described in detail in a COP. Regardless of the type of objection, whenever those types of decisions are issued, the state is encouraged to identify alternatives that would make the project fully consistent. Next slide. DOS has created multiple online resources to learn more about our decision role, and many of these are highlighted here. I'd like to particularly draw your attention to the New York State Information Gateway. This is an online mapping tool that provides state, federal, and regional data sets all in one location. It's a very helpful resource. And I also have my contact information as well as the general mailbox for Department of State consistency reviews here. And I want to thank you for your attention and opportunity to discuss New York's coastal management program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Our next presenter is Laura Morales, the permit manager for Empire Wind. Laura?
Thank you, Pam. My name is Laura Morales. I'm the Director of Permitting for the Empire Wind Project. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the last BOEM scoping meeting for the Empire Wind Project. Next slide, please. Empire Offshore Wind, LLC, or Empire, which is the permit applicant, is a joint venture between Equinor Offshore Wind US, LLC, and BP Wind Energy North America, Incorporated. The lease area OCSA 0512, which is associated with the Empire Wind Project, was awarded by BOEM on April 1st, 2017. As shown in previous presentations, it's located in the New York Bight, and the lease area consists of the Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2 projects. With an acreage of up to approximately 80,000 acres, this lease area offers more than 2 gigawatts of energy to be provided to New York through the success of the Offshore Renewable Energy Credit, or OREC, solicitations issued by New York in 2018 and 2020. We anticipate that first power will be provided in approximately 2025. And these projects support the New York goals for the 9 gigawatts of offshore renewable energy by 2035. Next slide, please. So first, a project overview. The map that you see there on the left is the Empire Wind lease area, and it shows the approximate delineation between Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2, where Empire Wind 1 is delineated in yellow, and Empire Wind 2 is in purple. The lease area at its closest point is located 14 miles from Long Beach, New York, and 19.5 miles from Long Branch, New Jersey. The construction operations plan contemplates the full build out of the lease area. And again, that's consisting of Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2. Empire Wind 1 was a successful RFP award in July of 2019 from those OREC solicitations. And it's an 816 megawatt project consisting of 2 submarine export cables that go from the lease area and enter into New York Harbor, eventually interconnecting into Gowanus, New York. Empire Wind 2 was the successful New York RFP award in January of 2021, and that's a 1,260 megawatt project consisting of 3 submarine export cables entering into New York in proximity to Long Beach, New York, or town of Hempstead, with an interconnection into Oceanside, New York. Next slide, please. When you go to BOEM's website and click on the construction operations plan link in the websites previously provided by BOEM, you'll see the full construction operations plan for Empire Wind. And that consists of volume 1, which is the executive summary, the project design development, and the project description. The project design development walks through how Empire Wind established both its preferred siting as well as its preferred technologies for its project design envelope. And the project description are the details of the project design envelope, including the dimensions of certain facilities, as well as the preferred routes and locations for its facilities. Volume 2 are the resource chapters, where 2A are the physical resources, 2B are the biological resources, 2C are the cultural resources, 2D are the visual resources, and 2E are the human resources and the built environment. And you'll see each of the associated resource chapters under each one of those volumes. Volume 3 are the technical appendices. There are over 30 technical appendices available on BOEM's website, and those are all the detailed analyses that were prepared to support the narrative within Volume 2. Next slide, please. As we zoom into Empire Wind 1 and its onshore facilities, you'll see on the map on the right there the proposed submarine export cable as it comes into New York State waters, where New York State waters are shown in the black and white dashed line. The submarine export cable will continue north into Gravesend Bay, and you'll see a couple of different route variants that are under consideration for the project as we continue to understand the use of the area, including the federally maintained areas such as the navigational channels and the anchorages, as well as the site-specific data we've collected over the last few years for the project. The proposed export cable continues to go north into the Narrows with an eventual landfall in northern Brooklyn in Sunset Park at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. In the image on the left, you'll see where the proposed onshore substation location is, as well as the proposed operations and maintenance base for both Empire Wind 1 and Empire Wind 2, which will also be located at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal in Sunrise Park. After making landfall at the onshore substation, there's a short interconnection cable going from the onshore substation to the point of interconnection, which is the Gowanus substation just off of 2nd Avenue. Next slide, please. As far as Empire Wind 2 proposed onshore facilities, you'll see as we make landfall on the Barrier Island, we are considering 4 different landfall alternatives, 2 of which will be will be utilized to site the 3 cables coming to landfall. As we move past landfall, you'll see a number of onshore cable routes under consideration, where up to 2 of those routes will be utilized to site the 3 cables from landfall up to the onshore substation. As we cross over to the mainland, we head north to 2 different onshore substations under consideration. These are alternatives of each other. These are not 2 substations being proposed. And then from the onshore substation, there's an interconnection into the point of interconnection, which is the Oceanside POI located on the National Grid property in Island Park. Next slide, please. As we move to other facilities, we have the submarine export cable and inter-array cables. We have a number of installation methodologies being proposed in the project design envelope. For pre-lay, we consider grapnel or debris removal, pre-sweeping with either the suction hopper dredge or a mass flow excavator, pre-trenching and dredging at certain areas, including landfall or areas where deeper burial is required. For cable lay and burial tools, we consider plowing, jetting, and trenching, or otherwise known as cutting. And pictures to the right are some of these tools within the PDE. For target burials, we have 15 feet below current or future authorized depth or existing depth within those federally maintained areas. This is most applicable to Empire Wind Phase 1 when we talk about those navigational channels and anchorages within the New York Harbor. And that 15 feet below those parameters would be whichever is deeper. Every other location for the submarine export cable and the inter-array cables outside of those federally maintained areas, we have a target burial depth of 6 feet. Next slide, please. For offshore infrastructure, we have the wind turbines themselves. And so in section 3, you'll see the maximum dimensions of the wind turbines considered for the project design envelope. And you'll also find the foundations that are under consideration for both the wind turbines, which is the gravity-based structure, and the monopile foundation, and the single foundation being considered for the offshore substation, which is the pile jacket foundation. Next slide, please. When we talk about layouts, we have a number of layout rules that we have considered within our project design envelope. These have been developed through consultation with fisheries, maritime stakeholders, as well as drawing upon the previous experiences for offshore wind developments around the world. These are voluntarily applied to the project and are essentially the roadmap, for our engineering team to start with when they consider layouts for the wind farm. They're designed to provide flexibility on timing and design of final layouts, but within known and assessed limits. These rules reduce navigational risk and facilitate continued access to traditional fishing grounds. and also consider safety and have been developed to ensure effective search and rescue, or SAR, operations by U.S. Coast Guard. These layout rules were used in development of the Navigational Safety Risk Assessment, or the NSRA, which you'll find in Appendix DD, as in dog, of the Construction Operation Plan, and there are 9 rules that can be found in Section 3 of the Construction Operations Plan that are considered throughout the project design envelope and evaluated in the cost. As we shift to the next slide, please. Working within those layout rules, we have designed a layout that is analyzed in the Construction Operations Plan. You'll see that layout on the right, where the Empire Wind 1 turbine locations and offshore substation locations shown in orange and yellow. And for Empire Wind 2, the wind turbine locations and offshore substation locations shown in purple. When we talk about the wind farm development area, that is essentially the area in which there will be structures installed above the seabed, and are consistent with our layout rules. There will be no structure installed within 1 nautical mile from the traffic separation scheme or the traffic lanes. The PDE considers up to 174 wind turbine foundation locations total for both EW1 and EW2, 2 offshore substation foundation locations, 1 for EW1 and 1 for EW2. And again, this layout was holistically developed to be within and consistent with the layout rules previously described in the slide beforehand. Next slide, please. Our wind turbines and offshore substations will be lit and marked in accordance with all FAA, BOEM, all applicable FAA, BOEM, and Coast Guard guidelines and requirements for aviation and navigational obstruction lighting. Those guidance documents are shown in the bullets here. Also would like to highlight that Equinor is considering the use of a aircraft detection lighting system, or ADLS. And if that is implemented, that would be consistent with any approvals, appropriate approvals from these agencies. Next slide, please. A bit more about the Construction Operations Plan, again, found on BOEM's website. As Brandy had indicated, we did have a recent update to the Construction Operations Plan, where volumes 1, 2, and the appendices were updated to reflect most recent project design envelope refinements. Those project design envelope refinements include the reduction of the number of foundations from 240 to 176, the incorporation of a layout for those 176 foundation locations, and again, those were illustrated in the previous slide. The removal of the minimum sized wind turbine, we have a maximum sized wind turbine, and associated dimensions, and the removal of the pile jacket foundation as an option to support the wind turbines. Next slide, please. And this will be the last slide. We do also have future planned filings. These appendices and associated resource chapters are undergoing an ongoing update in accordance to an agreed upon schedule with BOEM. These appendices are either being updated to reflect, again, those more recent project design envelope refinements, and they just take a little longer to update due to the deeper analyses that are done, or they are being finalized to compile all the environmental data that we had collected in the last few years. For example, the MSIR Appendix H will be provided to BOEM in February of 2022. Each one of these resource chapters and appendices do note the ongoing update in the most recent submittal on BOEM's website. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation for the project overview. I want to thank you again for attending today, and I look forward to hearing comments from the public as well as your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you to all of our presenters. So in just a minute, we'll take a quick break and let folks stretch before we start the formal public comments. As a reminder, please feel free to continue to type any questions that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Following the formal public comment portion, we'll have time for BOEM representatives to respond to your questions. We will stop taking new clarifying questions at the close of the public comment portion of today's meeting. I'll note that any questions submitted to the Q&A will not be considered as formal scoping comments for the NEPA process. So if you wish to make a formal comment, please plan to either speak today or to submit your comments through regulations.gov or through the US mail. So at this point, it is 2:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break and we'll reconvene at 2:06 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So I think we're ready to get started with the public comment portion of today's meeting. As a reminder, I will call on the people who requested to make a comment when they registered. The names will be called in the order in which we received your registration. And after all those folks have commented, I'll ask if there's anyone else who would like to make a comment. You would then use the raise your hand feature on the Zoom platform, or if you're calling in by phone, you would type *9. And I'll call on people to comment in the order in which they raise their hand. So during the comment period, I will post the names of the next 5 speakers in the chat so you can see when your turn's coming. When I call your name, you'll receive a pop-up box on your screen that will allow you to unmute yourself to make your comment. Sometimes that pop-up box gets hidden if there are several windows open on your computer, so I'd recommend closing any extra open windows that you may have. And if you're calling in from a phone, you'll hear a prompt to press *6 to unmute your line. Please remember that if you have clarifying questions, you can still type those into the Q&A box on your Zoom platform. We'll stop taking new questions once we're finished with the public comment period. So be sure to submit any questions you have as soon as you're able. Please note that when we receive your questions and the team begins to work on the answer, we'll move your question into that dismiss category in the Q&A box. And then once ready, we'll read your question and provide an answer out loud. So a couple of ground rules for us to use during the comment period today. First, please limit your comments to no more than 5 minutes, and I'll post a timer on the screen to help you keep track of the time. At the end of your time, I will jump in to ask you to please quickly wrap up to allow others the opportunity to comment. If you're not able to complete your comments within the allotted time, you can still submit them in writing before the end of the scoping comment period, which ends on July 26, 2021. Second, please be respectful towards everyone who provides a comment during today's meeting. You each have a unique and a valued perspective, and no one comment's considered more important than another. And comments that are directed towards or are about another commenter are not in line with the intent of today's meeting and will not be allowed. And should any commenter's actions begin to distract from the purpose of this public scoping meeting, that speaker may be placed on mute or removed from the online platform. And finally, I apologize for mispronouncing anyone's name. So the names of the first 5 commenters have been posted into the chat. I'm going to read those 5 names, and I'd ask that if you're here and you still wish to make a comment, that you use that raise your hand feature on the Zoom platform at the bottom of your screen, or to press *9 if you've dialed in by phone. So the names of the first 5 commenters are Nadia Holbenici, Shiloh Felton, Carrie Martin, Jeff Kalin, and David Wallace. If any of you are on and are still interested in making a comment, if you could please raise your hand and I'll call on you in the order in which you registered. Great, thank you. There we go. Our first commenter is going to be Shiloh Felton. You should be able to come off mute now.
Hi there. Thanks for hearing from us today. I'm commenting from National Audubon Society. Audubon protects birds and the places birds need now and in the future. Our report, Survival by Degrees, found at climate.audubon.org, shows 389 species of North American birds at risk of extinction should we reach a global warming scenario of 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Audubon New York and National Audubon Society support the need for responsibly sited and operated offshore wind development to meet our clean energy goals to mitigate climate change. We applaud NYSERDA's efforts to inform baseline information of marine birds and nocturnal migrants in the New York Bight. However, the aerial surveys supported by NYSERDA are a starting point and do not cover enough of the area surrounding the wind energy areas, including Empire Wind, to adequately evaluate displacement. Additionally, the MDAT assessments, which are of a larger scale, are not robust enough to assess potential impacts from the project. The Long Beach landing site falls within a globally recognized important bird area, and the offshore wind array is likely important foraging and migratory habitat for a variety of bird species. We ask that BOEM outline in its environmental impact statement the agency's plan for coordinated monitoring across the region to understand potential impacts to birds from construction and operation of the Empire Wind lease area and others within the New York Bight, and to inform adaptive management strategies, and implement potential compensatory mitigation needs. We commend New York State for their successful stakeholder process, inviting Audubon as a voice for bird conservation to inform responsible offshore wind development in the New York Bight. And we ask that BOEM support this or similar regional stakeholder processes to inform their monitoring and adaptive management plans. We urge BOEM to coordinate and financially support regional monitoring, beginning as soon as possible to obtain adequate baseline information prior to construction. Baseline data should not only inform a risk assessment, but should be paired with post-construction monitoring and be adequate to inform impacts assessments. Required monitoring should include, but is not limited to, surveying the area surrounding the cable route and the project area, at least 20 kilometers beyond the project footprint, as well as the project footprint itself, and incorporate turbine collision detection technology. Monitoring efforts should address a broad range of avian species which may be impacted by offshore wind, including marine birds with high collision and displacement vulnerability, nocturnal migrants, and species listed under the Endangered Species Act and in New Jersey and New York's wildlife action plans, all of which are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Our next commenter is Carrie Martin. And Carrie, I think you can come off mute. There you go.
Thank you for hosting the virtual scoping meetings regarding the notice of intent for Empire Wind's offshore wind energy projects. My name is Kari Martin. I am the Advocacy Campaign Manager for Clean Ocean Action, a regional broad-based coalition of conservation, environmental, fishing, boating, diving, student, surfing, women's, business, and civic and community groups with a mission to improve the degraded water quality off the marine waters of the New York, New Jersey coast. Clean Ocean Action supports responsible and reasonable offshore wind energy development. This includes operation, management, and decommissioning, as well as the associated onshore infrastructure. However, this new uncertain industry requires additional investigation of areas with a focus on comprehensive, inclusive assessments of all offshore wind life cycle impacts. Clean Ocean Action feels that the number of proposals in various stages of development is too fast in the region, in the New York, New Jersey region. Clean Ocean Action is concerned with the proposed location of the Empire Wind project due to the busy port and vessel traffic in the region, as well as being a prime area for important fish species in the region. It is essential that BOEM include information from the U.S. Coast Guard to ensure safety, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, relevant fisheries councils, and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to identify and protect the marine species in the New York, New Jersey Bight and the Empire Wind EIS scoping process. Further, Clean Ocean Action is particularly concerned with the cumulative impacts to offshore habitat for a host of commercial and prey species and other marine species, including marine mammals. We are also concerned with the socioeconomic impacts to coastal communities, particularly fisheries impacts in those communities, and the economies that depend on the clean ocean. We will be submitting substantive written comments on this notice of intent as required, as set forth in the NOI. Thank you for your time and consideration of our comments.
Thank you for your comment. Our next commenter is David Wallace.
I'm David Wallace. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, David.
Okay. My name is David Wallace, and I represent the clam fishery, the surf clam and ocean cod fishery. And I will be brief. A number of us have attended numerous meetings with the Equinor and then Empire folks. We have expressed concern about their layout of their array, spacing their turbines very close together, which would prohibit us from being able to actually safely operate within the array without either damaging the structure of the wind turbines or our vessel or gear. So we are very, very concerned about, you know, how we as an industry will be compensated for the loss of fishing ground and for possible gear loss, both within the array and then on the export cables. Um, there have been numerous problems with this on the Rhode Island wind, the first wind array, and we know that this is going to be a problem for us in the future, and we need to have a resolution of this before it goes forward. And so we actually support at this time that the COP be disapproved, and I will be happy to provide written comments to BOEM with it before the 26th. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. The next 5 commenters are Jonathan Capillion, Peter Hughes, Maria Casper, Zachary Hirschfield, and Thomas McCarty. If you all are here and are interested in making a comment, if you could please raise your hand. Great, thank you. Our first commenter then will be Zachary Hirschfield.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Zachary Hirschfeld, and I'm a legal and policy intern with the Environmental Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, also known as NILPI. NILPI and our community partners combat health and disability and environmental justice injustices across New York City and beyond. Our environmental justice program targets the harmful environmental impacts that burden lower income and Black and Brown Indigenous New Yorkers through litigation, political advocacy, and coalition building. I am here today to voice our organization's priorities and concerns regarding Empire Offshore Wind LLC's proposed wind energy development. Right now, we are experiencing 2 crises: health inequality and climate change. Research suggests that if you are Black, Brown, or Indigenous, you are 28% more likely to live in a community with toxic emissions. These toxic emissions, such as methane and carbon dioxide, nitrous and sulfur oxides, have a devastating impact on public health by increasing rates of asthma attacks, heart attacks, and premature death in people with heart and lung disease. Climate change both accelerates these health inequities and poses new threats. Extreme heat, polar vortexes, and flooding, like we saw last week due to Tropical Storm Elsa, disproportionately impact communities in low-lying areas with less green space and poor energy efficiency. Black and Brown communities and their households pay more for energy as well. Nationwide, energy bills take up on average 43% more of a Black family's income when compared to a white family's. And so these families more frequently face impossible decisions to keep lights on, stay connected to the internet, keep heating and cooling systems running, or to put food on their tables. Empire Offshore Wind's proposed development has the opportunity to play a vital role in reversing these injustices. But simply installing more wind power will not be enough. The development must be carefully designed to help every community interacts with to be more healthy, vibrant, and resilient. With this goal in mind, I would like to highlight 3 key areas that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management must include in its environmental impact statement. First, the environmental impact statement must account for the project's local economic effects by aligning with the contracting standards of New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as the CLCPA. As a result, this project must prioritize the creation of quality, prevailing wage jobs for local workers, as well as a procurement strategy that centers direct community investment and a locally sourced supply chain. Done properly, this project will satisfy President Biden's Justice 40 initiative to deliver 40% of the benefits of climate investments to disadvantaged communities. It will also comply with Executive 12898, which directs federal agencies to develop a strategy for implementing environmental justice. Second, the EIS must ensure that the project, in all of its phases, from construction to isolation to operation, will not expose New York's environmental justice communities to additional toxic pollution. For example, Sunset Park, a neighborhood where one of the project's onshore substations is proposed to be located, is an environmental justice community that reluctantly hosts 3 peaker power plants, which burn fuel, oil, and natural gas. As a result, families in Sunset Park have been stuck with poor air quality and health outcomes for far too long. Any new project must not exacerbate or contribute to legacy policy, but pollution in any way. Third and finally, the environmental review must ensure that the energy produced will serve both peak and baseload demand on New York's electric grid, so that we can replace 3 dirty peaker power plants in Sunset Park, as well as the 16 other peaker power plants across New York City with cleaner, more resilient sources of energy. To this end, this project must be compatible with battery storage systems to deploy its wind energy on days when energy usage is highest. NOPI is a proponent of bold renewable energy projects. Uprose's Green Resilient Industrial District plan to reindustrialize Sunset Park's waterfront should be a model for renewable energy projects like this as a way to benefit the public health, economy, and resiliency of local communities. We urge BOEM and Empire Wind to ensure that this project benefits our communities equitably. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Our next commenter is coming from the phone number ending 6284. You should have received a tone to unmute. You can press *6 to unmute. And we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Alexander Kozowski. I am not representing anyone, just a concerned citizen who's been listening in for a little while and kind of compiling my own research over time, so my speech may not be as eloquent as those that have preceded me. I just want to voice my concerns. I've been doing some research as to wind energy and, wondering as a citizen if this is something that, is in, widespread agreement, and for our longitudinal future, if it steps in the right direction. I've already noticed that there is a large amount of landfill impact, that these turbine blades tend to build up over time. They're hard to destroy because they are made to withstand such strong winds and hail and horrible weather and erosional impact that they're actually hard to get rid of in maintenance, and it actually affects their ability to function as efficiently as designed on paper. Additionally, my concern is more importantly for the wildlife that really has no voice in this decision-making process. And I echo one of the other colleagues' opinions about maybe scoping more about where these birds are impacted most in their flight patterns, especially since many of them migrate in the evening, where they may not be able to see these turbines in the air. And additionally, gather more research as to how to appropriate transmission lines, because as we all know, electricity generation over longer transmission lines will actually lose some of its power over time, the further it has to travel down lines. So just on a personal level, beyond the aesthetic effect, my biggest concern is environmental impact. And moving forward, if it's something that the environment and biodiversity cannot overcome or adapt to, especially since reports have shown that hundreds of thousands of birds have been killed by turbines to date, then perhaps there may need to be some form of alternative solution proposed. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Our next 5 commenters are Sharon Bogdan, Michael Halprin, Georgiana Page Smith, Sarah Reed, and Daniel Schaefer. If you all are interested in making a comment, if you could please, you 5, please raise your hands. You'll see that raise your hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom platform. As a reminder, those names again are Sharon Bogdan, Michael Halprin, Georgiana Page Smith, Sarah Reed, and Daniel Schaefer. Okay, not seeing any hands raised from that group, so we'll go ahead and post the names of the next 5 comment. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, I see that you do have your hand up. Our next commenter will be Sarah Reed. You just need to come off mute, Sarah.
Hi, apologies, I'm here. I believe that Georgiana is also here. So she might not, I will check in with her after mine. Should I start? Okay. My name is Sarah Reed. I'm a volunteer member of 350 Brooklyn, which is a grassroots climate organization dedicated to local action. I want to just say a few personal things, which is that I remember the first afternoon that as a teenager, I saw a wind turbine on a beach on a family vacation, and I had never seen one before. But even at that stage in my life, what I had learned about climate change was keeping me up at night, making me walk long distances rather than drive, making me carry around soda cans all day to find a recycling bin. I felt so powerless and hopeless and was looking for any small way I could exert control over my own future. When I saw the wind turbine, I hadn't realized how graceful and beautiful that they would look in real life. And I wondered, and I still wondered today, how anybody could object to these graceful creatures on aesthetic grounds. More importantly, they gave me a sense at that time that the adults in the world were doing something about climate change that addressed its root cause, which I believe is our society's dependence on fuels that are killing us. I believe that by the time I was an adult, our landscape would be dotted with these wind turbines. I'm now 35. And it strikes me that the infrastructure I grew up with in the 90s has barely changed, even though in other countries they've built massive renewable infrastructure and high-speed trains. Today, the fear of climate crisis still keeps me up at night, sometimes due to worries about my potential future children or my in-laws in Bangladesh, one of the countries most vulnerable to climate impacts. Last week, it kept me up because it was simply too hot to sleep. I'm speaking out today to ask that when you evaluate this project, you think about this big picture. I'm asking that the upcoming environmental impact assessment fully account for the benefits and harm reduction represented by investments in renewable energy that displace fossil fuel infrastructure. In particular, I want to emphasize that the EIA should assess the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This should include the history of environmental racism in Sunset Park, where residents continue to suffer disproportionate pollution and health disparities, including during the COVID-19 pandemic, where pre-existing respiratory conditions gravely reduced patients' chance of recovery. It's a disgrace that our state would even consider allowing further fossil fuel infrastructure to be placed in these communities, but it is. This project would help us reject these projects once and for all. In making its evaluation, the EIA must compare the benefits of wind power not to a theoretical blank slate, but to the world that we live in now, a world that continues to rely on fossil fuels that aggravate the climate crisis. The federal government should look at the entire effect of the project, including positive impacts on air quality, investments in local communities, economic well-being, jobs that could be paid at prevailing wage under New York law, and environmental justice. I want to also echo the very valid concerns put forward, particularly by our colleagues from NOPI. But I just emphasize that the EIA needs to look at what a solution that is imperfect, but far, far better than any of the other solutions that we have on the table. And I look forward to seeing progress on this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. Our next commenter is Sarah Reed. Oh, I'm sorry, Georgie Page. Georgiana, you should be off mute now.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Georgie Page, and I'm a member of 350 Brooklyn, the local affiliate of 350.org, which works to counter the global climate crisis. I am a chair of 350 Brooklyn City Action Committee and a member of their steering committee. We represent thousands of active, engaged citizens across Brooklyn, and we work closely with our 350 NYC affiliate, as well as other local environmental organizations and other local environmental organizations. I have been involved in environmental work since the Exxon Valdez oil spill, when I took a week off of classes to clean birds on the coast of Washington State. I'm probably one of the rare environmentalists who has also worked in fisheries in Alaska. I joined the environmental movement because almost everywhere I look, I see a planet in crisis and people who are so floored by the everyday mechanics of their lives that they do not have the time or energy to take a step back and look at the huge variety of trends and movements, customs, and habits that are moving us from disaster to disaster. It takes strong will and tenacity to stand up and fight back against the fossil fuel industry, their millions of dollars of advertising and lobbying, and their lies. Greta Thunberg cannot do it alone. It will take all of us. In the past, I have used the analogy of an older athlete who loves the game so much, who is so conditioned to win, who has lived the sport their whole life and cannot recognize when it is time to leave the field of battle and focus their energies on other endeavors. It is that time for the fossil fuel industry. The era of fossil fuels is over, but many energy companies are still not accepting it. So our voices in defense of the planet must be just as forceful and passionate. We must make it very clear that our country is moving forward into modernity using modern energy. The future does not only belong to the Richard Bransons, Jeff Bezoses, and Rex Tillersons of the world. It belongs to all of us. Though 350 Brooklyn is not an environmental justice or climate justice organization, we have increasingly looked to marginalized, low-income, and frontline communities to guide our priorities. These are the people whose health and well-being should be guiding BOEM's assessment as well. When air quality is poor, some of us can buy an air purifier and hunker down at home as we work remotely. We might even be able to escape the city for a few days. Our brothers and sisters in the Red Hook or Gowanus houses cannot. They are stuck with an environment that is designed and designated for them by our governments. So their basic health and survival needs must be first priority. And any solutions that impact them must be designed brilliantly to address and redress the historical harm they are still suffering from. The environmental impact statement should include and assess the opportunity cost of inaction. As stated in an article by Stephanie McClellan, director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind at the University of Delaware, carbon pollution is making oceans more acidic and less oxygen rich. And the warming temperatures are fundamentally changing ocean ecosystems, jeopardizing coastal fisheries and the millions of people who rely on healthy fish for food. In addition, rising sea levels due to events like Hurricane Sandy are causing regular flooding in coastal communities, threatening clean water supplies and rusting away costly infrastructure, driving even more pollution into the seas. A complete benefit cost analysis must include all of the myriad harms and costs of continued fossil fuel emissions. In addition, there is a long history and legacy of fossil fuel pollution in host communities like Sunset Park and Red Hook, Brooklyn, with new sources of emissions being added daily. Red Hook recently became the location of last mile warehousing, adding diesel trucks to their burden of historical lead toxicity, a peaker plant across the water, emissions from the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, and a cruise ship terminal with its diesel emissions. Red Hook has the added burden of flooding when there are storm surges and receiving that sewage overflow from wealthier communities up the slope. So there are social and societal costs as well. What kind of price can we put on the lives of multiple generations of families living in the Red Hook houses? In this Red Hook community, as a case study and an example, we have met individuals with 8 out of 10 family members suffering from asthma. And asthma, the most common reason that children are hospitalized, has become a leading cause of absenteeism from schools in New York City. The societal cost of this asthma-related absenteeism totals billions of dollars in the US. And this does not account for untreated cases, non-medical costs, diminished productivity in school, or parent absenteeism. As I Can't Breathe has become a rallying cry across the country in communities of color, we must consider that the day-to-day reality of many low-income children of color living in marginalized neighborhoods is one of being literally unable to breathe on any given day, at any given moment, due to our inaction. There is a public health cost to continuing the fossil fuel status quo, and there is a hard economic cost. This cannot continue.
Thank you for your comment. If there's additional comments you'd like to make, please feel free to type those into regulations.gov or to provide them via US mail. Thank you. Our next round of 4 commenters are Kathy Malone, Alexa Mayone, Brett Sparks, and Kevin Costa. If you're here and you'd like to comment, please raise your hand. Thank you. Our first commenter will be Brett Sparks.
Hi, thank you. I'm Brett Sparks. I'm with the Fisheries Survival Fund, which represents the vast majority of limited access scallop fishermen from Massachusetts to Virginia and North Carolina, all along the East Coast. The scallop fishery is pound for pound the most profitable fishery in the United States. It's a highly lucrative fishery. However, the advent of offshore wind development continues to give members concerns. To be clear, FSF does not outright oppose the development of wind energy. However, we believe that every environmental review should be done in a way that adequately and comprehensively considers the potential impacts to this vital fishery. To that end, the COP submitted for Empire Wind, first off, misrepresents how scallop dredges operate within the fishery. The COP categorizes the scallop fishery as using toothed or hydraulic dredges, which have detrimental impacts to the ocean bottom. This is not the case. The fishery relies on a New Bedford style dredge that is different from these other dredges used in Europe and elsewhere. These dredges have little to no impacts on ocean bottom, sitting above the ocean floor as fishermen collect scallops. This single point raises a larger concern that the wind developers have a fundamental misunderstanding of the fishery, how the fishery behaves. And if there's no understanding of how the fishery behaves, then it's difficult to mitigate or understand what the potential impacts to this fishery are going to be. For instance, the COP represents that fisheries such as the scallop fishery can continue to operate within these turbine arrays in the Empire Wind Lease unimpacted. However, many of those estimates look at these boats fishing in isolation. That's just simply not the case. There are multiple boats fishing in this area at any time, as well as additional vessel traffic in and out of these areas. So those are concerns that need to be addressed in the upcoming EIS from BOEM. Further impacts to marine radar are another thing that the COP categorizes as having little to no impact. This is not the case. We have seen in the United Kingdom and in other fisheries in Europe where these turbine arrays have significant impacts on marine radar. This is something that absolutely has to be addressed in any future environmental impact statement before these turbines can be installed. Further, I believe some of the other commenters have noted this concept of cumulative impacts of development. President Biden has promised 16 project reviews for these wind leases over the next 4 years. That's a huge amount of development that's getting ready to be deployed in the Mid-Atlantic and New England areas. This environmental impact statement, as well as all future impact statements, must consider those cumulative impacts on not only on fisheries, but as many other folks have talked about, the marine environment as a whole, impacts to birds, impacts to whales, marine mammals. This is not something that can be considered in isolation. Another consideration that we would request the EIS seriously look at are impacts to scallop settlement and growth. The COP seems to categorize that there will be little to no impacts on larval movement of scallops. We have scientific studies that we will cite to in our written comments that demonstrate otherwise. These turbine arrays alter sedimentation flows, they alter ocean currents. This has a significant impact on the ability of scallop larvae to move through the ocean column and settle in these areas that are favorable to growth. So that's something we would request the EIS look at closely, as well as fisheries mitigation. The COP does little to discuss compensation amounts or procedures. This is something that we would like to see considered either under the EIS or in further conversations with developers. And then finally, we would continue to suggest that BOEM is still not seriously considered alternative locations for the Empire Wind Lease. We were told that this is something that would be taken up during the environmental impact studies. So we would request that BOEM consider alternative locations at this time, because we are getting closer to actual installation of these turbines. The location has never been truly considered as far as alternative areas, and we would ask that be done again, we will submit written comments and we appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. So those are all of the folks that had pre-registered to make a comment today. If you didn't pre-register, but if you'd like to make a comment, I'd ask that you please use the raise your hand button on your Zoom platform or dial *9 if you called in using a phone, and I'll call names in the order in which their hands were raised. At that point, you'll receive a pop-up box that will allow you to unmute. If you dialed in by phone, you'd just hear that tone and then you would use *6 to unmute. So our first commenter is Bonnie Brady.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I wasn't planning on making comments, so I'll try to make them as brief as I can. Bonnie Brady, Executive Director, Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. We will be submitting comments later. However, our association has been submitting comments since, I believe, 2014, if not before then, regarding this project, which has been ill-planned from the start. If you look at one of the slides that was shown in today's document, which I guess has also been shown twice, when the traffic studies were looked at, they used 2011 data when for commercial fishing boats, AIS was not even required until 2016. And in the case of New York, more than 90% of the boats don't qualify under the 64.5 foot length, so they would not have AIS. That area has been historically used as fishing grounds for our squid fishery, for our fluke fishery, scallops in the area. It is an area of high productivity. And when the director's memo came down from Abby Hopper, and the question was to remove the areas of fishing importance, nothing was done. I know because I met with Ms. Hopper the day before the lease area happened, and I had added the documents regarding the 2012 squid catch from that area, which had not been included in BOEM's initial study, which I believe was only showing 2006 through 2010 commercial fisheries data. There's many other comments that I could have, but I don't want to keep everyone forever. I will put it in, but we would request that this project at this time be halted. Also, I believe the gentleman from Fisheries Survival Fund spoke about the fisheries mitigation plan, and the mitigation plan is nothing but basically schmoozing. There is no actual compensation plan. There is nothing specific. I just read the document myself on page 26. And without that being written basically in stone and taking into account as they would if this was done in Europe, it really needs to be done because people will be displaced. And also with the transit, there are serious issues that have not been addressed and must be. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Our next commenter is Adrian Esposito.
Thank you very much. Again, I will be submitting very detailed comments, but just a couple of small comments for today. My name is Adrian Esposito, Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. And I think it's extremely important that as NYSERDA and BOEM look into the cumulative impacts of wind, we cannot just compare it to wind or nothing, but rather it needs to be a comparative analysis between if we do a wind project and climate change continues. So for instance, we hear concerns, as we should, about damage to birds. So if we don't do wind and we continue to rely on fossil fuels, what is the damage to birds? So any impacts to birds caused by the wind farm needs to be juxtaposed against damage to birds by not developing renewable clean energies, because it's climate change that's killing birds, whether it's birds that don't have a food source anymore because of shift in weather patterns, there's drought because of shift in weather patterns, loss of habitat because of shift in weather patterns. I think it's important for us to look at not just a wind farm in isolation, but what it means if we do nothing as a society to combat climate change. The same is true for our fisheries. You know, what about the loss of the fisheries because of climate change, such as lobstering in the Long Island Sound, which is now at 2% of the productivity rate that it was merely 15 years ago. The compelling reason for that is the shift in the temperature of the Long Island Sound, which has increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, winter flounder, which you really can barely find anymore in the estuary systems of Long Island. And what is the impact to our shellfish industry with the fact that there's acidification, and that's adversely impacting our clams, oysters, and scallop industries. In addition, because of climate change, harmful algal blooms are being fueled, not solely because of increased temperatures, but yes, in part because of increased temperatures. So if we do absolutely nothing to combat climate change, there are consequences to the same resources that some are seeking to protect. So I'm urging BOEM to look at this in a holistic fashion that allows us to make a comprehensive analysis and evaluation of the overall impacts to our ecosystem and to our environmental resources, whether we do wind or whether we don't do wind. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Are there any other people who had not pre-registered but would like to make a comment now? If you'd like to do that, please go ahead and raise your hand using the raise your hand feature on the Zoom platform. At this point, I don't see any additional hands raised to provide public scoping comments. As we've discussed previously, you can submit your comments through regulations.gov or through the US mail by July 26, 2021. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And when we return, BOEM representatives will provide answers to those clarifying questions that have been typed into the question and answer box during today's meeting. At this point, we're not taking any new clarifying questions, but the BOEM subject matter experts will respond to previously submitted clarifying questions when we return from our break. At this point, we'll go ahead and reconvene at 2:53 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. Thank you everyone for rejoining us. We can go ahead and get started with the question and answer portion. So I'll read out the questions that have been posed through the question and answer box, and one of our BOEM representatives will come on camera to provide the response. As a reminder, at this point, we're not accepting any new questions. We'll just be responding to the questions that have been previously asked during the meeting today. So the first question is from Dorian Dale. And the question is, a number of appendices under the Empire Wind construction and operation plan go to a two-pager that links out to Equinor, where, for example, Appendix 5, Fisheries Mitigation Plan, are not apparent. And this holds true for others as well. Many of the appendices on the Empire Wind construction and operations plan do not land. Brandy Sanguinet, would you be available to speak to this question and possibly to the next two questions as well?
Certainly.
Thanks, Brandy.
There we go. Give me just a second here. Some appendices to the COP will be submitted by Equinor at a later date, as agreed to by BOEM. You can refer to Equinor's last slide for the full schedule of supplemental filings. Equinor's presentation will be posted on BOEM's website shortly. Specifically for Appendix V, the Fisheries Mitigation Plan, that will likely be submitted along with Appendix U, the Essential Fish Habitat Assessment, which is anticipated to be filed in September of 2021. Additionally, some appendices contain, sorry, my page moved, sensitive resource information or confidential business information and cannot be shared with the public. However, the landing page will state that it is confidential information. Okay, next question.
Great, thanks, Brandy. So the next question, there's sort of two that are related, so I'm going to ask them to you together. One from Bob Boari, who asked, is there a 1 nautical mile grid layout planned for the location of the turbines? And a related question from Kari Martin, where the question was, how far apart will the wind turbines be as represented in the layout slide?
Okay, I got a little help from Laura Morales from Equinor to answer this question, so I wanted to give her some kudos for that. Equinor developed a series of layout rules in consultation with stakeholders that operate in the vicinity of the lease area, including members of the commercial fishing industry. These layout rules are represented in Section 3 and Section 8.7.2.2 of the COP. Specifically, rule number 6 addresses turbine spacing, and it says, where feasible, wind turbine spacing would be consistent and as far apart as possible, with maximum spacing in the dominant trawl tow direction where feasible, with minimum spacing no less than 0.65 nautical miles or 1.2 kilometers. So unfortunately, there's no like quick and easy way to answer your question. But I do want to point out that other layouts could be considered as potential alternatives in the DEIS. And this is an example of the type of scoping input that BOEM is seeking. And that's the end of my answer.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Brandy. I've got two questions next for Ursula Housen. Ursula, the first question is from Bob Boari. And the question is, how will BOEM assess the potential impacts to fisheries, particularly the impacts to commercial fishermen outside of the New York, New Jersey area who fish in this area?
Hi, I'm Ursula House, and I'm a fish biologist with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs. Thanks, Bob, for your question. Commercial and recreational fishing are important uses of the exclusive economic zone that BOEM will consider in its analysis and decision-making. BOEM will work closely with the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, to ensure that socioeconomic impacts of the Empire Wind project on the commercial and recreational fishing industry are considered in the environmental impact statement, including for members of the commercial fishing community from ports outside of the New York, New Jersey region who do fish in the New York Bight. You can find more information on these types of analyses for at least 10 years of historical fisheries data on the NIMS website, Socioeconomic Impacts of Atlantic Offshore Wind Development, at the URL that is currently posted in the chat. And thank you, Rebecca, for posting that.
Great, thanks, Ursula. And another question for you to respond to from Georgie Page. How exactly do the turbines interfere with scallops?
Okay, so thanks, Georgie, for your question. Project impacts will be fully analyzed in the EIS. Temporary impacts to scallops that are anticipated from project activities may include sedimentation and entrainment from jet plowing related to export and inter-array cable burial, while permanent impacts to scallops could result from construction of the turbines and could include crushing of the actual organisms as well as conversion of their habitat. BOEM is currently funding a study examining the effects of offshore wind farms on ocean hydrodynamics. This includes a study of, the study includes an evaluation of larval scallop transport and dynamics. And hopefully we can get that. There it is. Thank you, Rebecca. So that is the URL for that study. It is on, I think I can read this one. It is www.boem.gov/sites, SITES, /environment/environmental-studies/capital N, capital S, capital L -19-04.pdf. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you, Ursula. Our final question for today is going to be addressed by Laura Morales of Equinor. The question is from Thomas McCarty. And the question is, will the onshore cable for Empire Wind 2 be buried from either the connection points in TOH or LB to the substations in Island Park?
Thank you, Pam. And I'm assuming that TOH and LB are Town of Hempstead and Long Beach. All onshore cables that are proposed for the project, including Empire Wind 1 in Brooklyn and Empire Wind 2 in Long Island, will be buried underground. We are not proposing any overhead lines for the project.
Great, thank you, Laura. So those are all of the questions that have been shared through the question and answer box. I'm going to turn things over to Michelle Morin from BOEM for a few closing remarks.
Thank you. And my name is Michelle Morin, and I'm the Chief of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Environment Branch for Renewable Energy. And I want to thank the ICF and BOEM staff for successfully concluding the last of our 3 public scoping meetings for the Empire Wind EIS, and also the State of New York and Empire Wind for your presentations today. I think we had a really good turnout again in this 3rd meeting. We peaked around 100 attendees. So thank you very much for spending the last couple of hours with us and your thoughtful comments and questions. This information is really valuable as we determine the alternatives and issues to consider in the Empire Wind EIS. And as Brandy described at the beginning of the meeting, there will be an additional comment period and more public meetings when we publish a draft environmental impact statement next summer. And I think we all share the same goal, is to have the best informed decision possible. So again, your input is really important to reaching that goal. If you have any additional comments, please share those by the close of the comment period on July 26th. And again, thank you very much for participating in today's public scoping meeting.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for participating in today's virtual public scoping meeting. We appreciate your input and your involvement in the process. A recording of this meeting will be made available in the coming week on the project website. For additional information, please visit the virtual meeting room website, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.